Hey everybody, this is a video I've been wanting to make for a really long time, but I had to do some testing in order to do it, so I kind of didn't get around to it till now. So hopefully it's timely, and it has to do with time, so hopefully this will be good for people. I have a cheat sheet with me because I did a lot of tests for this video. So this video is on the off time setting on our printers, and there's been a lot of mystique and mystery about this setting, how it actually works. I've actually heard different things from different manufacturers. I've seen conflicting things all over the internet about how this actually works. And even I wasn't really sure myself, and I was going by, I guess, conventional wisdom that if you set your off time for less than, say, 5 seconds or so, it wouldn't have any effect. And then if you set it over that, we think we know what the effect was, that any time over that was the amount of actual time the light spent off. But still seems like a little bit of a mystery to me, this setting. And also, let's talk about what the impacts could be of using this. So actually, let's talk about impact first, then we'll get into my tests. So there's been a couple things floating around. One is that having a significant off time would allow your screen to cool and extend the life of your LCD screen. And I think this is almost like Mythbusters, will look like fact or fiction. So this one is fact. LCD screens degrade under heat and UV light, and the color screens degrade more quickly. The old tech, the mono screens, are less susceptible to degrading from the UV light because of the color. So having off time will let you have a longer screen life. How much exactly, that I can't answer yet, and the test that I did can't answer that. So maybe some engineer or physicist or someone could, better equipped than me can run tests where they could figure out, if it's possible to even figure out, how long can you extend the life of your LCD screen by using some off time, and how much off time would it have to be? I mean, if we're talking, you need to let your screen rest for 10 or 15 seconds between the light coming on again, you're going to triple the time of your prints. Maybe none of us will do it. We'd rather just pay for new screens eventually rather than slowing down that much. So it is a significant question that we do need answers. Unfortunately, I can't answer that. But some off time is better than none because it'll let your screen cool some. Again, the degree, the effectiveness of that, I can't ascertain right now. Thing number 2 I see floating around on the internet, that if you have off time, it allows your resin to settle in and could get you better prints, less fails, or more accurate prints. I've seen all different things. Now this, again, I've heard mixed things even from resin manufacturers and printer manufacturers. So I'm going to weigh in with my non-professional opinion on the things I've heard and just common sense. So let's talk about what off time does first of all. What it refers to is the time that your light spends off. And we'll talk about what numbers need to set to have an actual off time. But first, let's talk about what it means. So when your plate raises out of your resin vat, it rises up, however far you set your lift height, and it goes back down to basically contact the FEP, or your part of your model contacts the FEP, and the next layer gets cured to the model, or if you're in your early layers, to your plate itself. So as your plate comes into the resin, it displaces the resin. Resin, obviously it's a liquid, it gets displaced, it's moving around. So if your plate, in theory, comes down and flattens out, the resin's still moving and the light comes on, you could have, especially maybe more toward the edges of the plate, there could be some movement in the resin itself still. It hasn't settled. So it is possible that if you have a little bit of off time, you can make sure those particles aren't, flowing back and forth and trying to move while they're trying to be cured. So in theory, and again, my common sense take on this is I could see how that could work. Counterpoint to that is, if you're, let's say it's just use the plate for now instead of the model, but you can imagine it's the model. If it's flat, kind of smushed to the FEP, and there's only kind of one little thin layer of resin between the plate and the FEP, even if the rest of the vat is has some slight motion, could that really affect the bits that are smushed down against the FEP by your model or by your plate? I'm not sure, and I haven't got a really good answer from anyone. But again, using my common sense, I would say that it's quite possible, especially toward the edges. So there could be some effect, and especially if everything's not perfectly exactly level, there could be motion could affect things more in one area than another. So I do actually now use off time to give my resin a chance to settle. Maybe if I run, 20, 30 tests, maybe more, maybe I could try to ascertain if I can notice anything different in the prints. It's not like I get fails when I wasn't using the off time, but since I do see how it could be beneficial, I have started using it. Just for full disclosure, I use an off time and have been for a while. Okay, let's go back. So the other thing that happens with that off time is it does give your resin a chance to cool a little bit. And again, how much it could cool in just a second or 2 or even 3 seconds when it's in an enclosure, I'm not sure there's any significant cooling. But if it cools at all, could be a benefit, because we know the reaction. If you watch Goobertown, if you watch Brent's amazing video on resin, and we knew this before, but Brent really breaks it down really nicely. If anyone who hasn't watched this video should go watch it. I'll have a link to it in my description. It's an excellent video. And I want to say thermonuclear. It's a thermodynamic reaction, not a thermonuclear reaction. When the resin is being transformed from a liquid state to a solid state, and that heat, you do want it. Once the resin, we always talk about, and I always mention this too. You want to make sure your room is warm enough, but also once the resin starts heating up, you don't want it to be too hot. That can also have negative adverse effects also. So the resin gets to cool a little bit also if you have off time. Again, I'm not sure how significant it is, but it's not a bad thing. So there's no known downside to having off time, and I can't really think of any, especially when it's not, I'm not talking about days of off time, we're talking, a couple seconds here and there. So I think there's only benefits to it. So I would recommend everyone to make sure they have some off time. Now let's talk about understanding off time, just how it works in general. And I want to dispel some of the things I've seen all over the internet, because some people say that off time, if you have 2 seconds of off time, it means your light will stay off an extra 2 seconds longer than normal. I mean, common sense, actually, that's how it should have been. Like anything you set for off time, to me, should be extra time the light is off, but it doesn't work that way. The way it works is however long it takes your build plate to go up and down is calculated by Chitterbox, and any time you want your light to stay off in excess of that has to be above that number, which is the time to go up and the time to go down. So how can you calculate that, or what's built in, or how does it all work? Well, I went and tested this because I thought I knew how it worked, and I was mostly right actually, and not 100% right. And some things kind of almost didn't make a little sense to me, which we'll talk about. But basically, every machine, and I did my test on the Sonic Mini 4K, on the Epax X1K, on the Sonic Mini, on the Mars Pro 2. I didn't even bother to test my other 5 machines, because after doing 4 of them, I realized I think I have a good grasp on how it works. So if your machine has, and you have to bear with me on numbers, and I'll flash them on the screen so you can follow with me. But if your machine has, like all the smaller screen printers, built in 5 millimeters for the lift height. Okay, so stay with me. And let's say you're running a lift speed of 60 millimeters a second, which would be 1 millimeter. 60 millimeters per minute, 1 millimeter per second. This makes the math pretty easy, so we don't have to get into fractions, decimals, whatever. So if your build plate needs to raise up 5 millimeters and it's going up 1 millimeter per second, well, you've got 5 seconds for it to go up. Now, on the way back down, for ease, let's say you're using 180 for your retraction speed. Retraction is the speed at which the plate goes back into the vat. So if you're using 180, right, then it's going to drop down 3 millimeters per second. So it would take about, I don't want to get into it too much. Math, I'm just doing off the top of my head, say like 1.8 something seconds to go back down. So if you add those up, and let's round, let's just say it takes 2 seconds. I know it's a little faster. So that means it would take 7 seconds for your plate to go up and then go back down into position. So if you have an off time of less than 7 seconds, for sure, it's actually meaningless. So if you set your off time for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or anything in between, zero effect. Because those seconds are absorbed going up and down, there is no extra off time. So if you want off time on a standard setup on a machine, say where you're doing 60 millimeter per minute lift time and say anywhere from 150 to 180 on your retraction, if you don't set something 8 seconds or longer, basically, you have no off time. Okay, so let's talk about off time now. So let's say in that scenario, you set your off time to 8 seconds. And we know it takes 7 seconds for your plate to go up and down. When you set it for 8 seconds, what happens is the light goes off from a layer. Your machine goes up 5 seconds, goes down 2 seconds, back into the vat, pressed against the FEP. It goes into printing position. Then it pauses for 1 second and turns the light on. So if in this scenario you set your off time for 10 seconds, it goes up 5 seconds, down 2 seconds into position, sits for 3 seconds while that resin settles and cools and your screen cools a little bit, then the light comes back on. So that's how the off time setting works. The extra seconds of off time, as I said, occur when your plate is smushed back down against your FEP or your model is smushed against your FEP. That's where those seconds come into play. Now to test this, what I did was on my, first I did the Sonic Mini 4K, and I did 0 for the light off, and I was using, and I'm going to flash on the screen, here I was using 6 millimeter lift height, and I was using 50 millimeters per minute lift speed and 150 for the retraction. To make the math easier now that I think about it, of course, I should have just used 60, 60, 180. Makes the math a lot easier. So instead, I'm just going to round everything, but it's still, what I did was still valid, so it's okay. So on the Sonic Mini, what I actually found was interesting. What I did was I got a stopwatch out, well, an app on my phone, and as soon as the light went off, I hit the stopwatch, and as soon as the light came back on, I hit the stopwatch to stop. So again, there's human reaction time, but it should affect both things equally because I had to see the light go off before I hit it, then I had to see the light go on before I hit it again. So what I did was, just to be safe, I actually did it like 7 or 8 times just to make sure there was no real margin of error. I wasn't doing something wrong. And interestingly enough, it should have taken about 6 seconds, because I was using 6 millimeter lift height, 6 seconds to go up, a little less than 2 seconds to go down, and then the light should come back on. And that's what I found. It took, as best I could tell on my 7-8 trials, right around 8 seconds. So with the light delay set to 0, if you're using, as I recommend, 6 millimeter on your lift height now, even on the small machines, I recommend using a little higher lift height. I think you get more, prints won't fail. I think you get less fails if you have, give a little more room on the lift height. That way, if you watch my other video if you're doing thicker prints with more cross section that might deform the FEP more, I think it's good to have the extra lift height. So basically on the Sonic Mini 4K, if you're using that 6 millimeter lift height that I recommend, and you're doing 50, 50, 150 on your lift speed and your retract speed, you need to set your light off time more than 8 seconds in order for it to have any impact at all. So the next test, just to make sure that's right, I did my next test. I set the light off time for 7 seconds and tested again 8, 9 times, whatever it was. And it was the exact same as I would expect. there was no light off time effectively because I was under the 8 seconds of how long it really was taking my plate to go up and go down, which is 8 seconds in this case. 7 seconds didn't do anything. When I went to 11 seconds, now I had some real off time. It was still going up and down in 8 seconds, but then it was pausing 1, 2, 3, then the light came on. So setting it to 11 seconds gave me 3 true seconds of off time given those settings. So next I wanted to check out the Epax X1K. And I found something a little interesting here, which I still can't explain. I think I have to talk to Epax about to understand it. When I set the light off time for 0 with all the same settings, it actually took 10 seconds for the plate to go up and down, not the 8 seconds I was expecting. So because that stymied me a bit, I ran that one like 15 or 20 times to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. And yeah, it was 10 seconds up and down. So I'm not sure why that was. And when I moved the off time to 7 seconds for the Epax X1K, it still took 10 seconds up and down. It's almost, and I won't say it's like a light off delay because it didn't go down and then stop for a few seconds. It actually took 10 seconds to get into position. When I went to 11 seconds on the Epax X1K, it went up and down in 10, paused for 1 to get to the 11 seconds. So on my Epax X1K, I learned something today. When I've been using a light off time of, I think I was using 8 seconds on it, I was actually using 0. It's no effect. On the Epax X1K, I had to get to 11 seconds before I even got a true light off time. So something to keep in mind. And we're going to talk about what all this means after I run through these other two real quick. On the Frozen Sonic Mini, not the Mini 4K, the slightly older version, the Sonic Mini, it took 9 seconds to go up and down instead of the 8 seconds I was expecting. So now we've had two printers, the Epax and the Sonic Mini, where I was expecting to see 8 based on the exact same settings for every machine, I actually had 9. So there's another second in there somewhere. I don't know why. So again, when I moved to 7 seconds, 0 impact. Because I was under the 9 seconds, it just went up and down 9 seconds, light came back on. When I moved to 11 seconds, exactly as I would expect, it took 9 seconds to go up and down. It sat for 2 seconds in the vat, then the light came on again. And then the Mars Pro 2, the new Elegoo Mars mono screen, that one also took 9 seconds. So really strange to me that 3 out of the 4 printers where it should have taken 8 seconds like it took on the Sonic Mini 4K, it actually took 1 to 2 seconds longer to go up and down. I'm not sure it means anything or whatever. I'm going to talk to manufacturers and try to find out why. But it is curious that it worked like that. And again, the Mars Pro 2 had even another anomaly, which again I had to check like 10 times, which is the light. And this is weird. So I have to find out what this means because it's printing great for me, the Mars Pro 2. But the light was only coming on for 1.8 seconds. And this I timed, like I said, like 10 times, so I was so shocked because it's supposed to be 2 seconds of light, and it was a little less. So I'm not sure what that's all about either. So let's keep that to the side for now because we're talking about off time. So the off time, let's be clear on how it works. Whatever the time is for your plate to go up and down, and it's not standard, it's based on your lift speed settings, your lift height settings, and your retraction settings. So no one can give you an answer and say, set your off time for 10 and you'll have 2 seconds of off time. That's just not true. So it does depend on all your other settings. So this is what I'm going to advise you guys to do because I do think it's important to have at least 2 seconds of off time maybe per print. I think if you just want to be safe, if it maybe it makes your prints better, maybe it doesn't, but it'll improve your screen life a little bit. It'll let your resin cool a tiny little bit. All the things the screen off time does can only be beneficial. So until someone comes out and proves to me that none of these things actually confer any benefit, then I'd say err on the side of caution because it doesn't add much time. If you have like 2 or 3 seconds of off time in, it only adds 20, 30 minutes to a print usually, unless it's a super tall print, then it'll add more. But I think extra time to me is worth the fact that it might help. So let's talk about what you should do with your print. What's the takeaway from this? The takeaway from this is take your vat out, okay? Put a piece of paper in place of your vat. Take the build plate off too, okay? just run any print. When you get to your normal layers, so if you want to do this, if you really want to be judicious about this, set your bottom layers to 1, set your cure time for 2, set your normal exposure time as well for 2, your bottom layer exposure for 2. This just speeds up the process of doing this test. So what you do is, so put any model in with those settings, bottom layers 1, normal layers 2-second exposure, bottom layer 2-second exposure, 0 off time, and do, since we like to keep our lift speeds a little slow, do 50, 50, and then 150 for retraction. Okay? Get a stopwatch out on your phone or whatever you can use to time this. Start the print. Let the bottom layers go just in case there's any anomalies there, the one bottom layer. Once you get to the 3rd or 4th layer, it only takes a few seconds, what you're going to do is watch the light. As soon as the light goes off, start your stopwatch. As soon as you see the light come back on, hit it again. Do it 2 or 3 times just to verify that you did it right. And whatever that time is, 7 seconds, 8 seconds, or 9 seconds, add 2 seconds to that number, and that is what you're going to plug in for your bottom off time and your normal off time. And hopefully this will help you get better prints and less fails. So I hope I've demystified the setting and how it works. It's actually, from all the stuff I've read and what people say, like I said, there's never been a real true consensus of how it works properly. And there's still a lot of questions we have unanswered in terms of the effect of having some of that off time. But we do know, at the very least, it is better for your screen to have the off time. So let's do that. Let's preserve our screens because they are consumables. So let's put a little bit in there. So again, that's the test you run. That out, played off, time in between how long it takes the light to come on and off. Add 2 seconds to that, 3 seconds if you want to be really conservative, and use that for your off time. Those are my recommendations. So anyway, hope you guys learned something today. I hope this helps you get better prints, or at least makes your screen last longer, or whatever benefit this might confer. Hopefully you get it. My goal is always to get you guys the best prints you possibly can get. So that's it. Please like, please subscribe, please check out my other vids. I've been taking time off from making videos because I'm in the middle of my Kickstarter, which is going great. If you haven't checked it out, I'll have links in the description. Please check it out. I'm going to waste so much amazing stuff for a cheap price. It's like mind-blowing how good this Kickstarter is coming out right now. So anyway, please go check that out. Thanks, and happy 3D printing.